Not doing
None
of
that full court.
That's a young man's game. That's a young man's game.
Running back and forth. Yeah.
I do think that's your dreams trying to tell you that you're over the hill.
That's my subconscious is saying, this is what 30 is. This is what 30's like. So
I had a dream last night that my mom wanted to borrow my car to drive it out of state. And I was like, who's going to pay for all that gas? And she was like, well, you should just sell your wedding ring. So it's like, what's that dream trying to tell me, Mike?
Welcome to the Voyage podcast, a show that traverses the oceans of myth and legend through the lens of Catholic theology and philosophy. Come aboard as we set sail in pursuit of the heroic life and Christian virtue, with your hosts, Mike Schramm and Jacob Platty.
Okay.
So vampires.
Yeah, vampires. Speaking of, there's a famous...
Talk about derailing.
There's a famous painting called The Nightmare that has like this golem-looking creature, almost like a gargoyle, like sitting on top of a woman's chest. It's from the 19th century,
I can picture that.
Yeah, it's pretty famous. You see that oftentimes in like vampire collections. They'll use that as like an image of a vampire.
Like when somebody's researching, like when they're like, oh my gosh, is this a vampire? And that's part of their research montage is...
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
that's going to show up in that student's PowerPoint presentation. That image is going to...
honestly,
it's a creepy image, so it works.
Yeah.
So that's how we're tying the dreams to the vampires, Mike. See, I solved the problem.
Sure. Thank goodness. Glad one of us can keep this train rolling. Anyway, since we're still on Monster Month, since this Monster Month it's like you had to pick the October where there's 5 Tuesdays. So since we're still in Monster Month,
which I am so excited about. Hopefully we don't
we're going through and you wanted to be like, oh, it's so basic. We're talking about zombies, but it's like, what could be more basic than vampires? So why don't you kick us off?
You know what?
We're going to go through some of our favorites.
This is my opportunity. The reason why we're doing this vampire. And you know what? Before all said and done, I suspect we are going to do a second episode on Dracula. So this is kind of a two-parter, which we've been trying to get away from.
You suspect, as if the Dracula wasn't your first idea.
The Dracula, I want to talk about Dracula, but there's this, you see, Mike, this is a hobby horse of mine. A blood-sucking, undead hobby horse of mine, where I am going to bring back the true folklore of vampirism for a world that has turned them into sparkly, sun-drenched lovers or something like that.
I have no idea what that's a reference to.
Yeah, what reference could I possibly be making? Or I mean, honestly, we're going to go through all of it, but there's so much to discuss here, and hopefully it's not going to turn into just one giant cloud yelling lecture, but this is my platform. I have a platform, and I'm going to use it for the things I think are important, and that is demystifying vampirism.
He chooses the day that our
culture
producer calls in sick to to say, this is where I finally get to say my piece.
Right? We're going to set the record straight on this thoroughly abused folklore, which is way cool, especially for Christians. And it's going to take 2 episodes if you combine Dracula as like a second half to this episode.
We'll say that Jacob has that Von Helsing complex. He's got to...
I have a Van Helsing complex. That's right. Okay. So, but I also recognize that because this could just turn into me like lecturing the audience. So I thought ultimately I was like, you know what? We're going to make a little vampire story sandwich, Mike. And the first piece of bread is going to be just pop culture fun stuff. Let's just talk about a few vampire movies we like or stories.
That's accessible.
We're going to, it's like a compliment sandwich, only it's like interesting things for the audience in the front, stuff only Jacob cares about in the middle, interesting things for the audience on the end. And hopefully we just keep them. Hopefully they just persevere through my
I'll be sure to
ranting.
give the timestamp so people know when to skip ahead.
But you know what? I think this is all very interesting stuff. So hopefully our audience will too. But yeah, let's start out with some fun idea. Like, let's keep it fun. Let's like lure them in with the fun stuff.
Yeah.
So
No,
let's
I
talk
figured,
about vampire movies or books
we
or
can't talk
whatever.
about vampire movies without first talking about the basis, the foundation for vampire movies, which is of course Twilight. And so
Okay.
I thought that
yes,
See,
Twilights.
I wanted to go on that. I wanted to go on that angle. Yeah.
Nice.
No. So of course referring to the sparkly, sexy vampires that you were talking about. But anyway,
exactly.
what are some real? I can remember some real fun ones.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. Here's the thing.
Be
I'm super horror movie guru, vampire guru. I'm curious, like, what's your background? I mean, like, do you have? Do you care about this topic at all? Are there any movies that you actually like that are about vampires? Blah blah. Blah blah.
Well,
I should have said blah blah. But
speaking as so I probably the first I can remember probably too young, but have seen From Dusk Till Dawn, the Quentin Tarantino, George Clooney.
That is truly a
Robert Rodriguez. Is that? Yeah,
that's right.
But,
Robert Rodriguez.
Yeah.
Quentin Tarantino helped write it, and it was directed by Robert Rodriguez, though. Though I do believe
it definitely has that feel to it.
Well, all right. So it's an interesting case because it's almost there's two different movies that are slapped together. Do you remember how there was that Grindhouse thing that happened in the early 2000s where it was Tarantino and Rodriguez, and they both directed a film based upon old cheesy crazy movies from the 70s, and they showed back to back in theaters. From Dusk Till Dawn is actually kind of like a prototype of that. And if you watch that movie, the first half of it is Quentin Tarantino's movie. And it's got a very different vibe.
I was going to say, it's got a very
capture,
it's like a Reservoir Dogs almost kind of vibe to it.
Yeah, they take a hostage. It's about two brothers. One's played by Quentin Tarantino, and he's crazy. The other one's played by George Clooney, and he's like the straight-laced one. Yeah, it's what a wild thing that this movie exists. But like that one's really Tarantino-esque, and it's them talking witty dialogue, and it gets kind of crazy and sadistic. It's very
talking
Tarantino.
About burgers from McDonald's, I think, something like that. Or no, that's Pulp Fiction. Yeah,
that is Pulp Fiction.
It is that sort of like mundane conversation, like you were saying, mundane in the face of this, sometimes
it's
grisly
very
situation.
The second half, though, is when they get to a vampire infested. Actually, it's an adult strip club on the border, Mexican border.
Thanks for saying an adult strip club and not a
well, not for the kids, right?
Thanks for giving that qualifier.
But it's infested with vampires, and that's like a really loony, goofy second half of a movie, and that's Robert Rodriguez's half of the movie, and so it's almost like they did the Grindhouse thing like 10 years in just like one film, though. Anyway, that's a great pick. That's a great pick. It's not for the kids, but they get holy water and super soakers. This is a movie where you have a family. There's a lot of good themes in that movie too. It's about like family and redemption and all that. The father is a father. Yeah, the father is he is a pastor. I'm pretty sure he's a pastor, not a priest, but he is a church leader who has lost his faith. Yeah, he's lost his faith. And so now he's just taking his kids across country on a road trip. And that's how they get stuck in this whole thing, because Clooney and Tarantino, they're bank robbers on the run. And they hostage situation the family, and they end up at a vampire club. And but it's all about the father regaining his faith. Like he has to like find his faith in Christ again. In order to like bless holy water, basically. It becomes like a
it kind of ties into, and I can't remember where this episode is going to fall in relationship to our Babadook episode, but it's very much the purpose of exorcism is ultimately to bring about conversion and faith. And so you kind of see that theme. It's obviously not the same in terms of like exorcism here, but it's bringing out the evil, seeing the evil for what it is. And that's actually what spurs a person's deeper faith, deeper trust in Christ ultimately.
Specifically, it's what happens in that movie, because the dad, he's like, well, obviously evil exists. Obviously these creatures are demonic. And so if Satan's real, then God must be real too. And that's kind of like where he's like, you know what? Yeah, okay, I'm back. Let's do this. Let's fight evil with God. And so like and that's like in the script of the movie, you know, it's kind of like where he goes to. So we're not even like really like stretching it there. Anyway, he gets a bunch of super soakers and they fill it with holy water. And the rest of that movie, one of the kids has a jackhammer that has like a wooden stake in it. One of the kids has the super soaker and like water balloons too. What are some of the other wacky
Didn't they carve a
weapons
cross into the bullets? They carved a cross into the bullets, I thought.
Yeah,
Wasn't
they were
that one of
carved.
them too?
Yeah, into shotgun shells. And so, like, the dad, he gets a shotgun, but like the pump action has like a means to put another stick through it. So his shotgun is shaped like a cross, like when he's
So like a shield sort of thing too.
yeah, like he has like he holds a cross up and then he like puts it down and like shoots with it with a shotgun. Anyway, this is all very silly, but hey, you know what? Like, it's a good movie. I appreciate you bringing it up.
It has kind of a sort of cabin in the woods ending where you know how it pans out and you see like the ravine kind of underneath, behind the club.
Well, it's because you know all those vampires they live off of eating truckers, so the truckers show up to you know this adult entertainment location, get lured in, honey trapped, a gentleman's club, right?
Yeah.
A blue collar gentleman's club. And they get lured in, but those vampires, that's why they have super soakers, by the way, because there's all these like shipments. The vampires like have all these like trucker shipments, but they got to do something with all those trucks. And so they're like, they just like drive them off the ravine behind it. And so you pan out and it's just this like valley of trucks. Anyway.
Another one I remember is, and again, also pretty violent. Maybe I don't know if it's really salacious, but the Blade movie I remember seeing, especially the first one. I don't know if I even saw 2 or 3, but the first Blade movie I saw a few times. That's got a comic book connection too.
That is, yeah. That's based on a Marvel comic book. Back in the 70s, they were into the blaxploitation thing, trying to capitalize on that. And so a black vampire hunter, half vampire,
Daywalker.
A daywalker,
I think is
yes, indeed.
That's got a very mythical kind of sound to it, doesn't it?
It does. It does. It actually. So one of my personal favorites kind of stories is called Vampire Hunter D. This is a Japanese creation. It was a series of novels, and he had like 20 novels. They've started to be made into English. I've only read one of them, but they got turned into an anime too, like a couple anime movies. But Vampire Hunter D is the son of Dracula, and he is a daywalker, like Blade.
Okay.
He's half vampire, half human. But he has also turned his back. What's cool about Vampire Hunter D though is it takes place like 10,000 years in the future. And it's this really, really weird world that is like a mixture of like medieval reality, but it's also got like derelict old technology in it. But it's fundamentally like a European villager type, but there's also like Western elements. So that's what's so cool about it is like the world itself is this crazy mix of like medieval Europe, the Wild West, and like derelict space technology. And then you have the vampires and the human.
Cannibal for Leibowitz feel, where it's
like
we're in the future,
it's
but
very,
it also is
absolutely.
To the past
That's a
too.
good connection. It's very Cannibal Leibowitz, and the whole shtick there was the vampires actually rose up and took over humanity, and the apocalypse was like a vampire apocalypse. But then the vampires like fell into disrepair and like their culture died out. They like, I don't know, I forget, ran out of people to eat or something. Who knows? But like, so you have the humans trying to like recreate society in the aftermath of the vampires, and the vampires are still around, but they're far fewer in number, and that's kind of the context there. It's a fascinating mythology that he's
that's
made.
Not the one. No, because there was the other one, wasn't it called something like Daybreak or Day something?
Where, there's what is that? Daybreakers or something like that,
and Ethan Hawke, I think.
Ethan Hawke, yeah.
Where it's like there's like the vampires are running out of blood. The humans, like they haven't, you know what I'm saying? You remember that one?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I do. Absolutely. Yeah. It's also got the dude from Jurassic Park in it. Why can't I think of his name? I love that guy.
Sam Neill or Jeff
Sam
Goldblum?
Sam Neill. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
That's actually, that wasn't on our list, but because I didn't think of that one until just now when you were, but that's another.
I mean, I thought about like 20
cool
more movies I could have put on this list, but I can't. I mean, what am I going to do? So I tried to put representative movies from, there's a million vampire movies out there, that could have made this list. One of my more favorite ones from the recent years is What We Do in the Shadows, which got turned into a
Oh
TV
yeah,
show.
I
But
saw
that's
the movie. I haven't seen the
Taiti
show.
Wakiki. Did I say his name right? He's
Close
done the
enough.
last
Yeah.
couple Thor movies. Yeah. But he kind of made a splash with this pseudo documentary about vampires called What We Do in the
Mhm.
Shadows. And he's a New Zealand filmmaker. It takes place in New Zealand, and it's hilarious. It is a hilarious and loving send up
See.
of like vampire tropes. And the
Yeah.
TV show is hilarious too, but I feel like the
Okay.
first season was like the best by far, and the second
Yeah.
season's like you can really only just like keep going so long with the shtick, but they still do an
Mhm.
admirable job. It's just the first season's by far the best season.
Well, and the movie, I remember the draw for me was actually Jermaine Clement from Flight of the Conchords was in that.
Okay,
And so that
yeah.
was before I'd even heard of, the director. So no, it's, I thought the movie was like you said, it takes a lot of those tropes and kinda makes fun of them or looks at them in a funny way, and the whole mockumentary style, I mean, not only did it become super prominent after The Office, but, who was it's like the Waiting for Guffman, who was that director? This Is Spinal Tap. You know what I'm talking about?
Oh, well, that would have been was that Zemeckis or who did that?
No,
Uh,
anyway, that it's been around for
why
a
can't I
while,
think of that?
but he,
Hmm.
he does it with this really interesting set of characters, the vampire thing, and so it's like they become somewhat lovable, but they still kinda show their fangs, so to speak, at various points too,
Oh,
and
it's
that's
just really funny too. And honestly, especially the TV show, it starts to bring in other mythology, like other folklore, like ghosts or werewolves or whatever, and just like
yeah.
has commentary on them through the eyes of the vampires. Um,
Mm.
Go check out both if you guys want to laugh at some vampire stuff. Again, they're definitely not Christian TV shows, but they're quite funny, quite humorous.
A Another one actually that I just thought of that, wasn't on your representative list, not that you didn't think of it, but the Underworld series too.
Well, I wasn't sure if I should bring it up because like there's other stuff
Okay.
to get into. But yeah, this whole idea of like
Yeah.
vampires fighting werewolves and things like that. Hey, okay. So fun. That's fun. I like that. That's like a lot of fun, this idea that there's like vampires and werewolves and they hate each other and things like that. We're gonna
Yeah.
find out that that is not historically based. We'll just say
What?
that. Yep. I'm afraid the folklore, this is not reflected in the folklore, but
I
it
don't know
sure
which came
is
first,
fun.
Underworld or Twilight, but they lied to me.
Yes.
They
I have a
both have
chess
that,
set. I have a chess set that's vampires and werewolves. That's how much I think this is
uh,
a fun idea. Um, I actually I was like, "I want that for Christmas, babe." And so she got me, like, a really nice chess set that, like, they're all, like, carved, Like,
mm,
I'm really nerdy like that. But, no, and then What We Do with the Shadows, there's the werewolves keep peeing on their front lawn. And they do it intentionally because the werewolves hate the vampires and vice versa. And so, like,
yeah,
the beginning of it is like, "Get off my lawn," quit doing that. They keep catching them peeing on their lawn and things like that.
yeah,
And then they, they get into it's like there's gonna be a duel. There's gonna be a duel between their toughest werewolf and, the toughest vampire. And, like, the toughest vampire, he's, like, coded as, like, a warrior type from, like, the Ottoman Empire, and so, like, he's like, "Oh, I'm not worried about this," but then when the werewolf shows up, he's like a Hulk-sized werewolf, he's huge, and,
yeah,
he's like, "Oh, no." He's like, I'm in trouble here, I'm in trouble." He keeps trying to get out of the fight, and the other vampires won't let him out of the fight, but then, they're on top of a building, though. And one
mm,
vampire is like, "Here, I'll solve this." And he goes and he picks up like a stick or a bone or something like that. He's like, here, boy." I can't whistle actually. The audience
and
just
you
found that
can't
out. But so I can't make the whistle noise. But he's like, here, boy." And the werewolf's like, "Oh," gets all excited about it. And he chucks it off the roof. And the
can't
werewolf
resist that dog nature.
and the werewolf jumps off the roof after him, and that's how the vampires win the fight. Um,
Mm,
Funny stuff, man.
you can't take the dog out of the werewolf, is that
That's
kinda
right.
the
Yeah.
lesson there?
So
Well, maybe we've indulged the audience long enough. You wanna nerd out a little
now I
bit,
get to
Jacob?
now I get to slow this
Yeah.
conversation way down, get real academic with it, and
Oh, boy. Alright, let's
I
see
think
if
all
I
right, I
have any
think
other errands I
can we
can
just
yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah, we're just gonna you know what? I think this stuff's interesting. I think
I'm looking
I think
forward
the
to it.
audience I
I'm
think
looking
the
forward
audience
to
is
it.
gonna find this stuff interesting. Here's the thing that really, surprised me, uh, and I'll start with this. There was a guy named Montague Summers. Have you ever heard of Montague Summers, Mike?
No, I have not.
Montague Summers was a guy who lived in the early 20th century, and he was supposedly a Catholic priest. But what's funny about it is there's no records. You know how like the churches they keep like the rolls of people who have been turned
If
into
you've
priests
received a
or
sacrament, yeah, they keep track of it, sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
there's no record of him actually being ordained a priest, but he rolled around in like a monsignor's hat and garb. And so to this day, people aren't sure if he was just like LARPing as a priest or
Yeah.
if he actually was a priest. Because I guess in theory, you could go, he could have been ordained by a bishop, but he wouldn't,
I mean,
it would have been
in
like an
this time
illegal
period,
ordination. Like
so
he
it
wouldn't
could
have
have
been
been,
allowed to administer
valid
the
but not
sacrament.
licit. It
Yes,
could have been
yes. Some
valid but
people
not licit.
think
Yeah.
he was valid but not licit. That's the Catholic
Which
terminology I was
and
looking
especially,
for.
like, during this time period, it would have like, pretty much everything post-Reformation is when a lot of that stuff became more formalized in terms of not just the but especially the sacrament of holy orders. That's when you start to see what we now think of as like the modern or formal seminary setting. Whereas,
Hmm.
yeah, historically, it could have been a lot more informal. Before that,
Right.
but anyway, as
Well,
you were saying,
so Montague Summers, he takes witchcraft and folklore super serious though. And he writes a series of books that are downright impressive. Even people who think this is like just super silly stuff can't ignore how seriously he took this subject matter. And when he writes
hmm,
about it, it is chock full of like, and he was a very intelligent man. He could speak like many languages. So it's one of those
mhm,
books where he's like all this like Latin or French or German in it, and I can't read it because he doesn't bother translating it. He's one of those like he's one of those guys who like doesn't translate it for the audience because like if you're not smart enough to read this, then you're not at my level kind of thing. That's who
yeah,
Montague Summers was.
hmm,
But he wrote all kinds of stuff about like the lore of vampires. And that's where I was first introduced to like the actual historic kind of precedence of like what vampirism is. And it turns out that it is a fundamentally Christian folklore. Now, I know people
yeah,
say that vampire stuff is all over the world and like China has its own vampire type creatures and everywhere has their own vampire type creatures, right?
sure.
Like chupacabra or something like that, down South
Well,
America. It's like,
maybe that's what you'll draw out too is the difference between like the vampirism or vampire like
well, I don't know.
versus like the formal like the kind of the vampire as such. Is that
Yeah, we'll get to. I probably not. I mean, I don't know. We'll see where the conversation goes. The thing is
all
that
right?
like I don't much care for this idea that vampires exist all over the world. I mean, that's true, but like all those different creatures that like suck blood, they're not
Okay.
the vampire that we think of in modern culture. The vampire that we think of in modern
Yeah.
culture is this. It's because these ideas of like blood sucking, they do exist all over the world. We are going to get into that for sure. This idea of blood
Mhm.
sucking, what's up with that? But the idea that like an undead thing that comes back from the grave to prey upon other humans and is repelled by holy water and garlic and crosses. These are
Yeah.
all Christian themes. And the reason why all those things exist is because of Christian roots and things like that. And so it's
Mhm.
almost like the vampire is just this like super Christian soaked folklore. And for
Okay.
someone who kind of likes horror stuff, that just makes it really fun for me, right?
Yeah.
So to get into the specifics of it, most of this stuff also as an Eastern Orthodox Christian, this is all coming from Eastern Europe. It's
Mm.
Greece specifically, and then also like the Baltic countries up above it, and like the Russian, the Slavic countries. So not only is it like
Hmm.
super Christian folklore, it's actually super Eastern Orthodox Christian folklore. So even more fun for me, right?
Yeah.
But it's not that the themes of it are regulated to the eastern side of Europe or eastern side of the faith or anything like that. The themes they're pretty universal. So for the medieval mind, this is where I have to get all intellectual, nerdy, academic, is we got to talk about how medievals viewed reality and why this thing called the vampire makes sense and develops and forms as a folklore in the context of the medieval mind. Okay.
Okay.
So step one, evil, like we have this like super modern, like zoological method of categorizing creatures. So like there's zebras and there's elephants and there's humans and blah blah blah. And
Mhm.
like everything has a category, right? Honestly, I think the Catholic
Okay.
Church helped perpetuate this type of thing. So thanks, Catholics. But
Well,
medieval
it's
people,
science, okay?
yeah, that's fine.
It's
There's good
it's
reasons to categorize things. But it's to the more woo woo folk in the East, or the medieval peasant for that matter, right? West or
okay.
East or whatever. Evil is just evil. Like there's not like this kind of like deep breakdown of categorization. It's just like there's Satan, and Satan is trying to hurt you. And Satan has all kinds of different ways to try to hurt you. And sometimes those ways are like physical oppression, like sometimes it's like demonic possession or whatever. Sometimes it's being attacked. Sometimes it's being raided by Vikings. Sometimes it's a werewolf. Sometimes it's a
Mhm.
vampire, right? I mean, like, and there's always some kind of witch involved. So like,
Yeah.
and all of that is just one big lump of evil that is the opposite of Christ and his church and the kingdom of God. And there's no real, and this is why when you get into like the folklore of this stuff, it's all kind of like nonsensical in the sense that there doesn't, vampires and werewolves are the same thing. And, your
Uh-huh.
modern mind is going to be like, wait a sec, vampires and werewolves aren't the same thing, but you do see, like, so, like, for example, Dracula, he can turn into a
There's
wolf, right?
there's carryover, yeah, there's
Well, there's definitely carryover, that's true, but
yeah.
there's even, like, literal examples, like, one of like, Dracula turns into different creatures. He can turn into a bat, he can turn into a wolf,
Mhm.
he can turn into because he's a werewolf. Vampires are
Okay.
werewolves, right? And vice versa. That's why this idea that, like, vampires and werewolves hate each other and, they're, fighting each other across millennia, while fun, is not from the folklore. In
It's
the in
just
the
a sibling
folklore.
story is really what you're telling
Yeah.
me. It's a is that
Well
that's all it is?
and the other thing that has to get brought into it is, like, the occult practice stuff, right? So, it's
Mhm.
all witchcraft. It's all, like, a relationship with Satan, right? And so, when we're talking about, like, where these things come from, it always has
Mhm.
to do with satanic corruption. And so what will happen is that you will have a human and he will sell his soul to the devil in some way. Or she will become a witch or he will become a wizard or whatever. And they will
Mhm.
seek worldly power through satanic trials or satanic means or whatever. And they will become like in league with Satan, right? Like a Dr. Faustus type character, right?
Oh, yeah.
When
Oh,
they
that's another
die,
yeah.
yeah.
Mhm.
When they die, because they have given themselves over entirely to Satan in that way,
Mhm.
the result will be, and we'll get into it a little bit, but the result will be that they're going to turn into a pestilence for humanity, right? And they're going to plague their loved ones, and they're going to plague their community. And oftentimes, when they were alive, they would have done this by werewolfism, right? Lycanthropy. They would have been
Mhm.
like, because when you lose the image of God, when you are no longer seeking the image and likeness of God, then you
Mhm.
revert back to your base animal instincts, right? And
Yeah.
so you're a wolf. You're a wolf in sheep's clothing. You're tearing down your community, you know?
Well, and I think too, what this really speaks to is there's this sort of like backhanded recognition of the interconnection of the body of Christ, where, like you said, when if you're not working for the upbuilding of Christ and the kingdom, then you become something that sucks the life from it, right? And this is a literal kind of physical manifestation of that. And like you said, you lose so much of your humanity, but there's still enough there where you can almost like it kind of goes back to our when we talk about the uncanny valley, where it's like there still has to be enough humanity there for you to like recognize it, but then enough that's taken away where it becomes unnatural or uh, uncomfortable. And so, like when like we've talked about with the zombies, it's still the person or it still looks like the human, but they've lost so much of what makes them human, right? The soul. And The same thing when,
Yep.
like you were saying, the person has sold his or her soul to the devil, and so they've lost that part of them. And but there's still enough of them there where you can like see them, it looks like them or looks somewhat like them, or you can still see that last little shred of humanity. And what are they doing? They're sucking the life out of the community at large, the body of Christ in this case.
Absolutely. Well, and they're also, and we'll get into this more detail too. They are a profane caricature of the body of Christ, right?
Mhm.
They're a satanic inversion of the human, and the church, the practices of the church, and so we'll get into that in a little bit
Mhm.
too. But
Well, that's where the whole yeah.
how many
No,
times have you
definitely.
seen in a zombie show or a vampire show where like you have someone that has to like kill their loved one who's turned into a zombie or vampire or something like that, and there's someone else in the room, they're like, "That's not your husband anymore," or "That's not
Yeah.
your son anymore," you know? But like you were saying, it
Mhm.
still looks like my husband. It still looks like my son.
Or
And
is
in
there a
the
little bit of my son still there, a little bit of my husband still there, and can I cope with being the one to actually kill? What little left of it was there?
There is a really, really good 19th century story, from a guy named Tolstoy, but it's not the Tolstoy that we're all thinking of. Like different Tolstoy.
Ah.
I know. Ah, shucks. This was Alexei Tolstoy, and he wrote a really, really great traditional piece of fiction called "The Family of the Vordelak," because Vordelak was like a Eastern Slavic word for vampire. And in
Hmm,
that story, it's about a family that slowly gets turned in. They all get turned into vampires because they can't kill the dad. The dad is the first person to fall, and he's like, "Hey, if I come back in 10 days and I'm not back within 10 days, you got to kill me when I come back. You got to stake me in the heart." And he doesn't explain why, but he's just like, "If I'm after 10 days, if I'm late, you got to kill me." And he does
hmm,
come back late, but they won't kill him. And subsequently, the
hmm.
entire family falls, right? And it's all told from the perspective of like a person who is like staying with the family, like hospitality style, as he's traveling
Okay.
across Europe, and it's really
Mm.
great. It's a great little piece of gothic fiction. I think it was from
Yeah,
France, but it's about Eastern. It takes place in Eastern Europe. But
cool.
yeah, it's this idea that the family can't bring themselves to harm because of that Satan disguising themselves, garbing themselves in your loved one, you know.
Mm.
And that's what this vampire stuff is very much about. Is like the person comes back to destroy his family, specifically, especially this old folklore stuff, because what we have now in like modern interpretations of the vampire is that like they just travel the world, right? And they're kind of untethered. They don't have family, and they just prey upon strangers and things like that. That is 100% not traditional vampire folklore.
Well, because yeah, it's almost like now because we've tried to like rehabilitate the image where it's like, oh, they just want to be left alone. They're trying to stay away from everybody until they, because nature dictates they have to eat. And so, like you said, they become this sort of like wandering, I guess, traveler or whatever, because they've been kicked out of humanity as if humanity is the real problem. Is that kind of
Hmm.
the
Well, and
juxtaposition you're creating?
the juxtaposition I'm pointing out is that in the traditional folklore, they they harm their loved ones specifically, right? And I don't
Mm.
mean that in the sense that, oh, like, oh, this vampire has fallen in love with Bella and he doesn't want to harm her, you know? Like, I'm talking
Man,
about
you
like
just
they
gotta
come back.
grind that axe, don't you?
It's just why it's a
But
very popular story that everyone knows about.
sure,
But
sure, yeah. But that it
the
kinda speaks to the whole you have to invite Dracula in too, which we'll get more into when we get to the
And
specific
you
Dracula
do
episode.
have to. That's the other thing. Is
That's
like
the
even in the
significance.
traditional. Yep,
There
the
has to be this
father
level of
has to get invited
familiarity.
back in. And like so when he shows up, when the father shows back up after 10 days, he's like, "Aren't you going to invite me in? I'm your father." You know, he pulls like the father card. He's like, "What is this? What are you guys crazy?" Um
Mm.
and they get all ashamed and they like bring him into the house. And you know, it's like, "Oh, you guys are so dumb." He told you not to do this. Your father told you not to do this,
You're
and here you go.
you're the one yelling at the screen like, "Don't go in there, don't
Yeah,
invite him in, don't"
exactly,
that's
right?
yeah.
But, no, so in traditional folklore, a vampire comes back and, like, kills his mom, and then kills his sister, and then kills his brother, kills his children, right? Because, it's the destruction of the family, and to an extent, the destruction of the community, because when their own family when they can't feast on their own family, they go to, like, the 2nd layer of their family, which in a medieval community like, because medieval communities, they were super close-knit, right?
Mhm.
Like these villages, like were an extended family, right? And so it's very personal in vampire folklore. It's not like random strangers being killed. I mean, there's some of that, but like for the most part, the biggest fear is that your loved ones are going to be your destruction. And
Mm.
and some of this is because of like plague, right? I mean, this folklore is coming out of a world in
That's
which
an
like
interesting kind of
the Black Plague, well, because all right, so here's something I
well,
want you all to
it
keep in
kinda goes
mind.
back to the whole, like, personifying death thing, you know?
Yes.
And
Well,
what
because
better
these are
way
dead
to
bodies, right? These
what
are
better way for
reanimated
death to
dead
suck the life
bodies.
out of you too
Yeah.
is through this, like, personified disease. So that is an interesting,
Well,
I
that is
guess,
and
reflection.
that's 100%. I mean, 2 things to keep in mind. In the medieval world, it's all Satan, right? All evil is all Satan, and it's like, why is it a werewolf or why is it a vampire or why is it both or why is it disease or why is because it's all the same. Disease is
Mhm,
demonic. Disease is
mhm,
satanic. Sickness is a sign of demonic oppression, right? Plague, when plagues roll through villages and decimate villages starting in the family, your father comes home with the plague and spreads that plague
mhm.
to everyone who he loves, right? Well,
Yeah,
eventually this paradigm of your own family being your physical destruction that's the zeitgeist that vampiric folklore emerges out of,
yeah,
right?
they just
And
personify it. They just give
they
a
are,
name
yeah,
to
it's
it,
just
so to speak.
personified. It's just personified plague, right?
Which, I
It's
mean, go back to
personified
our
demonic,
like
satanic influence and things like
and
that.
isn't that what so much of mythology has always been, is just the, like, taking this reality of human nature, of human existence, or of human experience, and giving a name to it, giving a face to it. And so
Mhm.
here you have, like you said, one that is unique to the, what, late medieval European kind of experience.
Sure. Absolutely. And so to just like take the natural conversation path forward out of this idea that plague, because I think like a modern person could just like leave it at plague and the personification of death, which is a totally accurate
Mhm.
statement. But the vampire's a really good opportunity to reinforce just how much the spiritual and the material were the same thing to the medieval
Yeah, I
mind,
mean, what
right?
brought death into the world in the first place,
Hmm.
right? I mean, and so it's a recognition of the deeper reality, the deeper spiritual reality, not necessarily seeing this arbitrary division
That's right.
between, well, that's the world of germs and disease, and this is the world of devils. It's more like, and I actually remember there was this a writer who said, if I was the devil, I would want to use something like germs to bring, like, to hide behind. I'd almost like hide behind germs when I wanted
Sure.
to operate, or, bring fear into the world or something.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it just makes sense, honestly, right?
Yeah.
Like how humans are going to personify disease and destruction like this.
Yeah.
But because they have such a spiritual worldview that's so infused with the powers of the divine and the powers of the demonic, and you have
Mhm.
the sacred and the profane, right? Where the powers of the divine are suffused through the church and its sacraments and the community
Mhm.
of love and the sacrament of marriage and all that stuff. Well, the opposite of all that, the inversion of all that, is going to manifest in this creature too. So they don't leave
Yeah.
it at this kind of like biological level. They understand that it's both biological and spiritual. So that's why that's why they come back to life, right? So in the in in the origins, I said that word, the origins
Good
of
emphasis. Good
origin, yeah,
emphasis.
exactly.
Yeah.
Back in Greece, in the Eastern Church, excommunication is what caused vampirism, right?
Hmm.
Once you are excommunicated from the life of Christ, from the body of Christ, um, that's a surefire way to become a plague upon humanity, to be in your
Hmm.
death. Because when you die, your body won't corrupt. This is how it was understood in like I don't think this was like the official doctrine of the church, but I think this is like the opinion that like peasant people had in Greece back in like 400 AD, right? Where
Okay.
if you are bound by excommunication, then you will not corrupt until that excommunication is lifted. And so
Hmm.
you become undead, right?
Yeah.
This is where undead comes from. This weird liminal place where like they're dead, but their body is not allowed to die. And so because of the excommunication and
It's
because of
another lack
uh,
of unity that it has with the all the other Christians who have fallen asleep, right? Those who have they it's in a sense their soul is at rest, at peace with the rest of the body of Christ. But this one can't experience that because like you said, it's stuck in this in between space.
it is. And it's also a really interesting inversion of like saints not decomposing, right? Because
Uh,
simultaneously you do have strong Christian traditions of saints. Like, so the most godly people, their bodies will not corrupt and they'll turn into relics and things like that
yeah.
because of how holy they are. Well, this is like a weird perversion of that where
Yeah.
they're not incorruptible. They're so corrupt that they can't fall apart. Like, because of like
Yeah.
the binding
It
of the church on it kind of thing. And so these bodies come back to life and plague their families and things like that. And
mm,
so in all the things that we talked about, because all of this, like what gets you excommunicated from the church? Well, like
mhm,
witchcraft will, like making pacts with Satan will,
mm,
all that stuff, or
yeah.
suicide will, right? Because that's another really, really common through line is that suicide or violent death is also a cause of vampirism, right? So if
Mm.
you die by your own hand, if you commit suicide in the medieval mind, you've made your deal with the devil. You've rejected everything that Christ has given you by killing yourself, by removing,
Well,
and you've done it against the image of God within you and things like that. It's
and just to
satanic.
plug in really quickly, this is like you even said, this is the medieval mind where maybe pastoral theology and just our understanding of psychology and depression has come a long way. Where that's not by any means what the official stance is or what it has to be. It's just
Sure.
more. This was how medieval people made sense of the reality that they were seeing.
Yep. Yeah, I
For
don't want to be
hundreds of
insensitive
years.
too. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So I just
Um,
just a very quick. I didn't want to derail you, but I just thought
no, that's
since
nice
you
of you to
brought
say.
up
It's a
that
good point.
example,
Yeah.
so.
Well, and then also other examples would be like being hung at a crossroads because the crossroads
Mm.
was this geographic location, a liminal space where Satan did his work.
I was
You're
gonna
not on
say
this.
that's in a lot of movies, that's where it happens, right? That's where the
Yeah, the
person has
crossroads.
that deal
It's
makes
all
that deal with
tethered
the devil.
together. It's all satanic. It's all making deal with the devil. It's like violent. It's like unpeaceful death, right?
Mm,
It's the way you die, or if you're excommunicated from the church, if you're separated from the community in some way, if you remove yourself from the community, if you pursue Satan, this is when you become a plague upon your family and your community, and you come back from the dead
mm,
because you can't die. You can't death was given by God as a boon for humanity so they wouldn't live in sin forever. They wouldn't live in sin
yeah.
for eternity. If you reject that, then you will live forever in sin as a vampire. You will not
Well,
die in the same way that we're supposed to die, the type of death that God gives us as a
yeah,
mercy.
I mean,
You get a
that's
type of
what
death that's like a weird caricature of death.
and and maybe this is where the whole, like, sympathizing for vampires in a lot of modern media comes from, is because we do recognize that there is something sad about this. There's something miserable about this prolonged existence, spread what's the I mean,
Mhm.
to make it a Lord of the Rings reference, it's the butter spread over too much bread. Like, that's exactly what Bilbo's taught, like,
Yeah,
he's
no.
becoming, right?
That's
That's a
gonna there's our
vampiric. There's
bingo.
our yeah, all the way down.
Yeah.
So, but it's the like, that's exactly what, Tolkien was drawing from when he has his Gollum character, when he has what is happening to Bilbo, fortunately slowly, and they talk about the circumstances for that. But it's also why, if you remember, do you maybe as a kid, did you have to, in, like, 6th grade, have to read Tuck Everlasting? Where they drink from the
I
spring
haven't.
and they live forever? But
Uh-uh.
that's where, like, again, they don't become vampire, but they do live forever when they drink this
Right.
water, and the family did it accidentally, so they weren't trying to, but
Mhm.
you sympathize with them because you recognize how out of place they feel, how it feels like their existence is just
Yeah,
drawn
how
on and
tough
on
that
and
would
on,
be. Well, even
and
people who
it's the same thing with
caricature
yeah.
Well, even people who caricature the Christian promise of eternal life, they'll
Yeah.
say, "I don't want that. I don't wanna live forever," kind of thing, because they
Mhm.
recognize that if you think that eternal life is sequential, if it's chronos,
Yeah.
that, like, that becomes a hell over time,
Yeah.
right? The one thing I do think that's those types of themes are good fodder for vampire movies.
Go back
There's
and listen
a
to our time episode from a couple of weeks ago, by the way. That's
um, but, like Interview with the Vampire, there was a movie that had Brad Pitt and,
oh, yeah, the Tom
uh,
Cruise, yeah.
Tom Cruise. It's
And then
based
they
on
made a
Anne
new
Rice, really, really
AMC.
popular series. Yeah, they did an
Yeah.
AMC one. I think that one's full of, like, weird stuff, but, like,
I
of
haven't
course, it's
seen
all
it, yeah.
vampire stuff, so it's all weird stuff, but, like, that's a really interesting movie, frankly, a really good drama about vampirism, but the main theme of it is just being doomed to, like, live forever, having to kill people you don't wanna kill and things like that, so it's a very
Maybe
humanizing
that's where
take.
the sympathetic maybe that's where the
Yeah, it's very
sympathetic,
oh, that's
track
been going
started.
around. We can get into it when we get to the second part of the sandwich where we bring back stories again. But like, what I will say in the folklore, that's all hogwash. In the folklore, it's kind of like when we were talking about how like you don't have to sympathize with orcs in our
Yeah,
Mandalorian episodes. Like, no,
okay.
they're parasites. They're parasites.
Yeah,
Like they have sold their soul to the devil. They have rejected love. They have rejected Christ. They have rejected God. They have lost their humanity, literally. They have become undead animals that bring nothing but pain and destruction to the people they loved most in life because that's like the choice they made.
hmm,
And that's how they're going to be used by Satan now to afflict humanity. So there's no sympathy for these creatures. Like and they're very zombie like, frankly. Like so at
hmm,
the end of the day, they don't even most of the time, especially in like the real early folklore stuff, is like, well, I take it back. There's kind of two different like strains here. One strain is like they do have like the pretense of humanity. So think about the family of the Vordalak thing. The father's like, "I'm still your dad, let me in," kind of thing, right? They do
yeah,
there's examples of that, right? But then the second example though is like they're basically zombies. They're basically
hmm,
zombies. They've lost their humanity entirely and they literally just kind of like roam around trying to, get back into their homes where they used to live and like literally parasite their family,
hmm,
suck their blood.
yeah,
So before getting back to the other story stuff, let's just do a quick run through of how this inversion of Christianity looks in vampire folklore. We will start obviously with like crucifixes. The
mhm.
popular tradition is like if you have a cross, vampires can't stand the cross, right? It is literally because it's the cross of Christ. It's literally
Oh,
because
I mean,
demons, the
there's nothing
demonic, the
magical about
satanic,
2 yeah,
yeah,
2 pieces of wood put together, or the
yep,
letter T, which
yeah,
I'm
they
pretty sure
can't
I've heard a
stand
stand-up
Christ.
comedian talk about how vampires have a hard time reading because of so many T's that they come across, but anyway,
Very
not to
good.
lighten this up too much, yeah.
No, exactly, exactly. Or, holy water, right? Again, and
Mhm,
so I put into the outline here just some of the prayers that are said in the Eastern Orthodox Church over holy water, which
mhm,
I think are I'm just gonna read them real quick, for the sake of this episode. That these waters may be sanctified by the power and effectual operation and descent of the Holy Spirit. That there may descend upon these waters the cleansing operation of the supersubstantial Trinity, and remember, folks, we're talking like this is all like plague and disease stuff, right? The vampire
yeah,
is like a parasite and a disease upon humanity. This idea of cleanliness, of purification, as opposed to like disease, right? I mean, think of like leprosy in the Old and New Testament. It's the idea that there's no difference between being healthy physically and being healthy spiritually and things like that.
sure, yeah,
Um, that Satan may be speedily crushed under our feet, and that every counsel directed against us may be brought to naught. That the Lord our God will free us from every attack and temptation of the enemy, and make us worthy of the good things which he hath promised. So these things, some of these prayers are what's said over holy water when it gets blessed, right? And that
hmm,
water, in turn, is what's used against undead, evil parasite creatures, right?
yeah,
Um, when we talk about the cross in the church, one of our hymns is "Let God arise and let His enemies be scattered. Let those who hate Him flee from His presence. As smoke vanishes, so let them vanish, and as wax melts before the presence of fire, so let demons perish from the presence of those who love God and sign themselves with the sign of the cross." Right? This is all like good versus evil, triumphant
Well,
Christians against like the powers of darkness stuff.
and,
You know?
we were talking before of, like, where in the spiritual context do we see holy water the most is in the context of baptism, which it's not as obvious or as clear in the Western tradition, but, you are seeing a sort of reemergence of the emphasis on the exorcism aspect of a baptism. That in this, ceremony that includes holy water, where the water is used to give new life to the baptized person, there is an exorcism that takes place. And it's like that still happens. And so the whole connection of holy water and banishing, evil
Mhm.
spirits or banishing the devil, um, it reminded me of, and I can't believe I didn't think of this earlier when we were talking from dusk till dawn. So you brought up how they put holy water in the squirt guns. Did you ever see that meme or that picture from the 2020 pandemic of the priest who was baptizing a baby with a like spray squirting the water at
Oh.
the
Oh, no.
baby? I'll have to send it to you. It'll have to be the episode art, and, yeah,
Oh,
it'll be
no.
the,
Yeah,
there was
honestly,
a
that
priest
might
with a
be
squirt
episode art,
gun
yeah.
with holy water, and you can see the
Yikes.
parent, 6 feet apart holding the baby and, being baptized, so,
Wow. Wow.
yeah.
That's crazy. Um,
Anyway, sorry
so
to
yeah,
derail
no,
again,
that's
but
fine. But anyway, it's cool. I mean, this is why I love this folklore so much because it's so like Christian, right? In its
so
emphasis.
theological.
It is, yeah,
Yeah.
But how about things like garlic, right? That doesn't seem so obvious. We can say holy water and cross is obvious, right? Well, it's because
Mm,
back in medieval apothecary, right? Back when in kind of pre-modern medicine stuff like that, garlic was one of those type of superfoods that has like antiseptic qualities. So they
hmm,
would use garlic as medicine to fight disease and things like that.
hmm,
And because the vampire is just a form of disease to the medieval minds, right? As they understood disease as both a physical and
yeah,
spiritual reality. Yeah. So, well, this helps my wounds heal. And so it'll ward off evil spirits too. Right.
yeah.
And, even up as
No, that's
late
an
as
interesting one.
yeah, even as late
Uh,
as, World War II, the Russians were using if they didn't have penicillin, they would use garlic and, like, treat their
hmm,
wounds with garlic and things like that because it's just they've been doing it for 1,000 years. So that's where garlic comes from. It was medicinal. But then, the biggest inversion of or commentary on this, but this is a good inversion of where the vampire is in relation to Christianity is the blood sucking itself, right?
yeah,
So, like, and no, this is not something like the idea that the life is the blood, for the blood is the life, is obviously famously in the Old Testament. But
mhm,
this is a human universal. This is why you
yeah,
have blood-sucking creatures in China and South America and in Europe and things like that, Africa.
mhm,
Every civilization has this idea that the blood is the life. So the Old Testament did not introduce that idea to humanity.
no.
And you can see it in all kinds of like pagan stories too. Like famously, a
Well,
really good example is Odysseus.
and this goes into one of the, so you talked about how, yeah, it wasn't introduced in the Old Testament, but it also goes into the, prohibitions of the Israelites in the Old Testament is because this was being used to a very nefarious purpose in the context of worship, in the context of idolatry. Is that I didn't wanna, like, is that
Oh,
kinda where
no,
you're
no,
going
that's
to?
actually I'm glad you went there, yeah, because, Odysseus would have taken us a little bit outside the if we're in the Old Testament still, I put, Psalm 16 as a reference to the Canaanite blood libels or
Mhm,
libations, where they would be pouring the blood into and so, like, animal sacrifice as such, like, if you really wanna get into, like, how sacrifice works in any context, both the Old Testament and the pagan context, the Lord of the Spirits episodes, they have really, really good breakdowns of like how like blood is like life stuff. It's like
mhm,
organic life stuff. And so the people get sprinkled with the blood. And because they're
yeah,
being given life, the blood is being applied to them and the life is being applied to them, kind of thing. But, the
mhm,
demonic pagan sacrifices, they were being offered blood. The demons were being offered blood in these kind of blood sacrifices, human sacrifices too. And
Yeah.
and that's all vampire stuff. I mean, it's clearly to the medieval Eastern European, they would have that's part and parcel of why they think vampires are what vampires are, because demonic entities want to drink blood. Because
Mm.
all humanity knows that from time immemorial. Dead things want to
Mm.
drink blood. And so where I was going was Odysseus, has a really good example. Homer, Odysseus has to feed blood to the dead people so that they can talk, because they need life
Mm.
stuff. If they don't have blood, they're just shades. But if they have blood, they can perpetuate their existence.
Well, and you see this in a lot of not even necessarily vampire stories, but when somebody is like doing some sort of magical conjuring or creating some sort of seal, it always requires, the character has to like cut his hand and let some of the blood drop into the cauldron or into the, you know what I'm saying, into the
Oh yeah.
thing.
Yep,
Because
absolutely. Give
yeah,
a bit of their life.
so but it's this idea of, yeah, it's, whatever spirit you're conjuring is like drinking that blood. It's taking that in. And usually
Mhm.
it's a bad guy. So it kind
Yep.
of, kind of
No
works. It's
doubt.
kind of fitting. So
No doubt. And clearly this is all a satanic inversion of our Eucharistic act as
mm,
the body of Christ. And then we participate in the body and blood of Christ and things like that. We have a sacred ordained way to manifest this spiritual truth that the blood is the life, right? And
mm,
so these weird perverse undead entities that are perpetuating their existence by taking the blood in themselves, perpetuating their undead, quote unquote, life by sucking the life out of other people. That's all just
mm,
Satan stuff to the medieval mind. It's like, and it all just makes perfect sense.
yeah.
So I know that we're wrapping up, we're getting to the end of this episode, but I promised a second loaf of bread, second piece of bread on
Mm,
this. And that's intentional because next time we're going to talk about Dracula.
yeah.
You can't have a conversation about vampires and not bring up Dracula, but there's so much to unpack in Dracula that I
We
was like,
gave in and gave him a part two.
I
Gave him
need
a
a
part
second
two.
episode, right?
Yep.
But a brief little, literary review of the things leading up to Dracula works for this episode. So let me just
All
give
right.
you a quick rundown. It starts with Lord Byron. Everyone knows Lord Byron. He was a famous poet in the early 19th century, and he was famous for being like basically a debauched libertine.
Mm,
And he introduces the first English poem of that references vampirism. It
hmm.
was called the Yor or the Jor. I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's not a
Yeah.
poem about vampires, but it has an example of vampirism in it. And I won't read all of it, but you can go Google like what he says about vampires, and it's a reference to a person coming back to the dead and killing their family. Right.
Hmm.
In other words, we're not at sexy vampire in 1809 when
Well,
Lord Byron is writing about vampires. Even though Lord Byron himself is a famously debauched person,
yeah.
he understands vampire, and he learned this in Greece, by the way. He took one of those like European tours of the continent and he went to Greece, and that's where he heard of vampires.
Hmm.
But yeah, and in that context, yeah, the vampire comes back and kills their family, right? So we're not
Hmm.
sexy vampires yet, folk.
Mhm.
Um, But he had a buddy who quickly became not his buddy named John Polidori. He was his doctor, his traveling doctor. He was the same age as Lord Byron, but he came to hate Lord Byron because Lord Byron was a jerk. And so he wrote a
Hmm.
vampire story called The Vampire. Creative. But hey, if it's
Yeah.
like the
Well,
first one, then he
I was
gets
gonna
it,
say
right?
it is because yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
They didn't even like people didn't even like know what vampires were. And so yeah, you can just say the
It's
vampire.
not
Oh,
a
what's that?
vampire story, it's the vampire
Yeah.
story.
And he literally just takes Byron and turns him into a vampire character named Lord Ruthven. And Lord
Hmm.
Ruthven, he goes around seducing women all over Europe and like killing them and like ruining their reputations. That is literally so
Hmm.
this is like a super not veiled attack on Byron's character.
Okay.
And but this is the origin of the sexy vampire that seduces women and all that stuff. It's The
And I think
Vampire
there
by
is
John
some,
Polidori,
if we're
1819.
seeing it if we're seeing it through the lens of sin, because we can see sin itself as sucking the spiritual life from a community.
Yep.
And you're talking Victorians, like what's the sin that they're like obsessed with in terms of sucking the life or the respectability out of the community? It's going to be something to do with lust. It's going to be something to do with, and so that you have this vampire who is already symbolic of sucking the life from. And
Yep.
now it's like, how do we, almost like spiritualize that, but not spiritualize it in the sense of like actual spirituality. It's more like the spirit of our community. That seems like
Sure.
a good sort of analog.
Well,
Not that I
they're
don't
not
like,
mutually exclusive, and that's why
yeah,
we're actually, when you get to Dracula, you're gonna see both. But, this is kind of like the prototypes. This is like where all these things, because
yeah,
we went through a whole episode of, like, vampire lore, where it's pestilence and disease and demonism
yeah,
and killing your family. It's like, well, how do you get to sexy vampire? How do you get to
mm,
sparkling sexy vampire, in the sun from all that? Well,
yeah,
kinda through John Polidori, because he's making fun of Lord Byron, or he wants to tear down
yeah.
Lord Byron's reputation. And so
When
one of
it's
the
like
things
Lord
about this,
Byron is fine with this. He's like, "Hey, I can
yeah.
live with that." Yeah.
Yeah, and honestly, but there's no
Backfired a little bit.
references to Christianity in The Vampire by John Polidori. He really
Yeah.
is, like, he's taken this idea of, like, destroying people by sucking their blood, but it's not within a Christian context at all, right?
Mm,
Because this is like romanticism and post Enlightenment, and he's really just adopting this folklore to fit a very different story type. And so that's where you actually see the divergence in English literature. You start with Lord Byron himself actually having a reference to a traditional, like, vampires are pests that kill their family. But then you get John Polidori, his buddy, creating a vampire tale that becomes really popular, but it's all about the sexy vampire that lures women. After that, you
mm,
get Varney the Vampire in the mid 19th century. That is, I haven't actually read this because it's like 800 pages, but it was really
mm,
popular at the time. That's an example of a vampire that, so far as I know, it's not like rooted in Christian tropes. It's still just a
mm,
vampire rolling around, attacking strangers, traveling the continents, just like pulpy, salacious, biting on women's necks type stuff.
mm,
But then these are all like the most popular. Oh, I should mention that family of the Vortilac. This was a French story, but it got translated into English, and that was a really famous one too. That one is very traditional. That one
mm,
has killing the family rooted in, the cross becomes like the main character gets saved because he's wearing a cross, and the cross
mm,
intervenes between him and this, person that's going to kill him kind of thing. There's a monk
yeah,
in it that gives him advice, so that one still has a
mm,
lot of like Eastern European Christian tropes in it. But then in the 1870s, you get Carmilla, which is a great story. I actually love the story Carmilla. It's really famous nowadays because it's got a lot of like proto lesbian stuff in it. And even I have to admit that the story does have things that are really easy to get lesbian connotations from. Like the main character's like, it's like
okay,
she loved me like I was a man, like it's like, okay.
mm,
But Carmilla, she can't stand Christian stuff. So they got the Christian stuff back in it. There's a funeral procession, they're singing hymns, and she has to like stop her ears up and like la 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 la, I don't want to hear this, she gets
yeah,
sick. And then after that you get Dracula. And that's for next episode.
and yeah, well, no, thank and I appreciate the recap too, because it does kind of build us up to so that we can more fully appreciate the, when we talk specifically about Dracula, even though we might go through some different iterations of Dracula, where we can see a lot of these things come from. And now that we have this foundation too, seeing a lot of the very explicitly spiritual side to it too. So yeah, thank you, Jacob, and thank you, guys, for coming to listen to this episode of the Voyage podcast. Look forward to hearing from you guys. Leave a 5-star rating, leave a positive review, positive comment, and that can kind of get this podcast out to more listeners, and we can start to just kind of share this conversation with others. So, thanks, guys.
Come back, part 2.
Thanks for listening to Voyage Podcast. The Voyage Podcast is a production of Voyage Comics and Publishing, which seeks to create exceptional entertainment informed by Catholic values that inspire people to live a heroic life. Voyage Comics seeks to advance truth and beauty found in powerful stories. To learn more, visit voyagecomics.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.